Okay, I think we'll begin in just we'll begin now. So good evening. My name is Benjamin Blumberg. I am a graduate student at the University of Chicago and a founding member of the Platypus Affiliated Society. On behalf of Platypus, I'd like to thank you all for attending our plenary panel this evening and for making our third international convention a great success. I'd also like to extend our thanks to our speakers this evening, all of whom have traveled a great distance to participate in this discussion on the legacy of Trotskyism. I'll introduce our panelists shortly, but first I'd like to say a brief word about Platypus and to introduce the subject for our consideration this evening. Platypus was founded in December of 2006 and has subsequently grown to include chapters at numerous universities around the United States and internationally. We exist to host the conversation on the left about the unresolved, forgotten, and often tabooed questions that animated the left historically, from the Enlightenment of the 18th century to our present moment. If you'd like to find out more about Platypus, please feel free to talk to us outside of the event afterwards, and I'd also encourage you to attend our closing plenary tomorrow, What is Platypus's Critique?, tomorrow morning beginning at 11 a.m. in the SAIC ballroom where the Friday plenary was held in 112 South Michigan Avenue. Tonight, as part of our ongoing investigation into the open historical problems of the left, we are asking the question, what is the relevancy of Trotskyism for the left today? On the one hand, there is a simple answer. The mantle of Trotskyism is claimed by many of today's most prominent and numerous leftist parties in America, in Europe, and beyond. In America, there is the International Socialist Organization. In Britain, it is the Socialist Workers Party. In France, it is the new anti-capitalist party, which also has its roots in Trotskyism. Evidently, the collapse of Stalinism in 1989 left Trotskyism's bona fides as anti-Stalinist Marxism intact. On the other hand, Trotskyism has been infinitely associated on the left with sectarianism and martyrdom, not least in the circumstances of the murder of Trotsky himself in 1940. Certainly, the ISO, the SWP, and the MPA long ago made their peace in crucial ways with the politics of the post-Marxist New Left, a revision that their sectarian brethren, for instance, Trotskyism's bête noire, the Spartacist League, have proudly and doggedly opposed. However, despite their differences, all varieties of Trotskyism evince the conditions of the New Left's return to Marxism, in the 1970s, for which the legacy of Trotskyism provided one significant vehicle, the other being Maoism. For instance, Trotskyism's biographer, Isaac Deutscher, strongly influenced the journal The New Left Review, still a flagship of the left today. And yet there is something peculiar about this legacy. As one Platypus writer has suggested, Trotsky is as out of place in the post-World War II world as Voltaire or Rousseau would have been in the world after the French Revolution. Trotsky, unlike Trotskyism, exemplifies the classical Marxism of the early 20th century, and that tradition certainly died with him. Thus, before we can understand Trotskyism's legacy, how Trotskyism's legacy has influenced the Marxism of our time, we must first answer the question, what is Trotskyism made of Trotsky's Marxism? Now I'll introduce our panelists. Speaking first will be Bryan Palmer. Bryan is a professor of history and Canadian studies at Trent University in Peterborough, Ontario, in Canada. He's the author of several books related to the history of the left, including James Buchanan and the Origins of the American Revolutionary Left, 1890 to 1928. The second volume of this work is forthcoming. Bryan will be followed by Mcnair. Mike is a tutor in law at St. Hugh's College at Oxford University. He is also a member of the Provisional Central Committee of the Communist Party of Great Britain, the author of the recently published pamphlet Revolutionary Strategy, and a self-described former Trotskyist. Next will be Jason Wright, who will be representing the Trotskyist Organization, the International Bolshevik Tendency. And finally, Richard Rubin will be speaking on behalf of Platypus. Each speaker will have approximately 12 to 15 minutes to present their prepared remarks, after which we'll have a round of around 3-minute responses, which they can give to each other. And then finally, we'll conclude with questions from the audience, which I'll moderate. And I just want to say now, and I'll repeat this before we enter into the Q&A, that I'll ask the questions be kept under 2 minutes. But any real question or even comment from the audience is welcome, so long as it abides those guidelines. So now, without any further ado, I will turn the mic over to Bryan.
Well, thank you, Ben, and thanks to Platypus for organizing this event. Thank you all for coming. I start with a quote that all of you will have heard: "A specter is haunting Europe," wrote Marx and Engels in their 1848 pamphlet, The Manifesto of the Communist Party, The Specter of Communism. Can all of you hear in the back? It's all okay? Okay, good. Now, we live obviously in a very different epoch. Communism haunts very little of everyday life in our world of 2011. Platypus, I think, captures something of our dilemma with its proclamation, "The left is dead, long live the left." I take this to mean that we are, in our current circumstances, pinned down by the defeats of the 20th century left, inhibited in our realization of possibility by the demise of the forces of the revolutionary left, which, after all, are the forces of our own production. To transcend this substantive limitation, which threatens humanity, by circumscribing its realization through the left, which is the only possibility, the left must, of course, live again. It must experience a rebirth. Long live the left, then, is not merely a hope, a slogan of desire, a rhetoric of proclamation. Rather, it is a necessity, and not only for those who advocate and understand this, but for all of the globe's people. And yet the specter of communism, as I've said, the specter of the left, does not haunt today's powers, be they old or new. For those who aspire to be part of the revolutionary left, our specters are different. The specters that can be seen to be haunting our world are of a decidedly different and indeed often negative kind. The two specters that I would focus on are the specter of capitalist crisis on the one hand and the specter of Stalinism on the other. If one such specter, which is really a death agony and a long march of capitalist crisis, actively sort of structures our lives in terms of intensified exploitation, deteriorating standards of life, widening oppression, environmental despoliation, and imperialist war and carnage, the other specter, more of a ghost than either a death agony or a haunting challenge, the specter of Stalinism, has unleashed assumptions of global capitalist dominance in our era. It has broken down the possibility of oppositions to the extension and realization of a system of profitability and its incessant crises. And it has soured, of course, the understanding of socialism in the mouths of the planet's people. So these dual specters have produced the dialectical dilemma of our times. Never has socialism been more necessary and more obviously the solution to capitalism's quickening pace of crisis, and yet never has socialism, since its inception in the aftermath of the bourgeois revolutions of the late 18th century, seemed in some senses more distant and more unattainable. The left seems dead, even as it holds, obviously, the keys to humanity's emancipation and survival. It's against this backdrop, one dialectically at once of pessimism and of possibility, that the legacy of Trotsky's Marxism must be assessed. Platypus presumes that the legacy of Trotsky's Marxism can best be evaluated by exchanging what it calls the cherished memory of Trotsky as the martyred anti-Stalinist for the more painful image of Trotsky as the last man standing among the ruins of revolutionary Marxism. In contrast, I cherish nothing about martyrdom, but view Trotsky's assassination in the light of Stalinism's legacy, the degeneration of the fundamental revolutionary program of proletarian internationalism and its replacement through time with the politics of socialism in one country, a profound shift in theory and in practice that turned revolutionary possibility into its opposite, an end that signaled the defeat of the world historic accomplishments of 1917, and that indeed consequently required the obliteration of all voices of that original revolutionary victory. The history of socialism in one country has, of course, been a profound history of failure, regardless of the routes taken towards it, be they Stalinism in the USSR, Guevaraism in Latin America, anti-colonialism in Africa, Maoism in China. And Marxism, I would argue, is not in ruins, but is in fact an insightful and retains its insights and illuminations in terms of explanation of all of this. It is a considerable irony that even as bourgeois economists and organs of the bourgeois media confirmed Marxist insights into capitalist crisis at the height of the 2008 and 2007-2008 subprime mortgage meltdown, there remain those progressives and ostensible leftists proclaiming Marx's death. For me then, and I'm going to skip a lot here, Marxism tells us a great deal about why capitalism inevitably leads to crisis, why it inevitably produces widening spheres of exploitation and intensified oppression. Trotsky's legacy in particular was to build on Marxism's historical development and its many contributions. More than an analysis of capitalism, Marxism also confirms a way out of the recurring crises of that profitability system. Trotsky's contribution, as one who stood on the shoulders of Marx and Engels and Lenin, as one who theorized the revolution betrayed and built an organizational edifice of alternative to the consolidating Stalinist Communist International, is, like his predecessors, alive, pregnant with possibility, and as yet, the best guide revolutionaries have to what is to be done in an age overripe with capitalist decay and burdened indescribably by Stalinist degeneration. So my answers to the questions posed on this panel as to whether or not Trotsky's Marxism continues to matter, and if revolutionary consciousness in the current conjuncture is possible, are of course both resoundingly in the affirmative. One decisive component of Trotsky's contribution, an extension of the thought and practice of Marx and Engels on the one hand and Lenin on the other, is the importance of the subjective component within the objective circumstances. As a revolutionary Marxist response to Stalinism, Trotsky provides the continuity in different conditions of the accumulated gains of Marxism-Leninism in an era of revolutionary degeneration. As such, Trotskyism necessarily accents that in a period when capitalism is overripe for revolutionary overthrow, the crisis of humanity is indeed the crisis of revolutionary leadership. This seemingly simplistic maxim, so curtly dismissed by all of those ostensible Marxists for whom now is never the time to struggle, never the time to build a disciplined party, never the time to call for capitalism's defeat, is in fact centrally important in grasping what the revolutionary left has failed to do in the current hour of need. For many years I've been working on a study of James P. Cannon, a founder of American Trotskyism, and arguably one of the most significant figures in the history of the United States labor and left milieu. Time and time again, Cannon was forced to take principled stands, often against his will and personal inclinations, that left him marginalized, isolated, seemingly, quote, the last man among the ruins of revolutionary Marxism. Yet his history shows that he, like Trotsky, was never the last man standing, that his worldview, his principled stands, his continuity with revolutionary Marxism in all of its richness and complexity were seemingly not capable of being simply described as somehow falling into disuse. However marginal and seemingly lacking in influence Cannon and his small army of Trotskyists were in the United States of 1929 or 1934 or 1943, their capacity to chart a path forward mattered. From no more than 5 to 6 steeled proletarian Trotskyists in the coal yards of Minneapolis in 1932, for instance, emerged organizational drives among Teamsters that culminated in 7,000 truckers, helpers, warehousemen, and others flocking to the Union banner in 1934. This transformed Minneapolis, known as a scab town, with a history of labor relations far worse than that of places like Detroit and Los Angeles, which were also seen as bastions of the open shop in this era. This saw workers refuse to be beaten into submission by police and the vigilante forces of capitalism. It turned Minneapolis into a union town, literally over the months of one summer. A decade and more of dominance of the open shop, of scabs, of stool pigeons, and of the politics of subordination were transformed as tens of thousands of workers mobilized in support of a truckers' strike in an unprecedented general strike. And finally, it was this general strike among other such developments across the country, that spearheaded the drive to industrial unionism that led to the CIO breakthroughs of the Flint sit-down strike and the great post-World War II strikes that brought blacks and immigrants into American trade unionism in unprecedented numbers in the 1940s. Compared to the base level at which revolutionaries in the United States commenced their efforts to form the Communist Party in 1919, or at which Cannon and his allies struggled to form a Trotskyist left opposition against both capitalist descendants and a Stalinist stranglehold over the left in 1929, or at which Vincent Dunn and Carl Skoglund, the two key Trotskyist organizers in the trucking sector in Minneapolis, started their attempts to unionize in 1931, our situation today is quite true, objectively different. There are many forces arrayed against revolutionary initiative. Yet we are perhaps less objectively constrained in the current moment than we are subjectively impoverished. The will to fight, evident in so many ways in the recent history of the sporadic upheavals in the United States and Canada, epitomized by the grassroots rebellion in Wisconsin, is not the problem. Rather, it is lack of leadership. The same could be said of struggles in Egypt, Syria, and elsewhere at the current moment. Not only then are objective conditions arrayed against the formation of revolutionary political organizations, crucially, it is illusion in the Democratic Party in the United States, the curbs constantly placed on struggles, and the barriers erected in the path of struggle by ossified labor bureaucracies that tend to hold people back. This is perhaps the most critical component of the failure of the so-called Wisconsin idea to flourish and effectively resist the ideas of established power. Why this crisis of leadership? The answers are many, and of course they are complex. A plenary such as this allows only for simplification. But the failure of the intellectuals in our time is legion. They have proclaimed themselves progressives, even revolutionaries, while they have tended to embrace every atavistic, puerile, pseudo-intellectual turn imaginable, so long as these fresh and new ideas repudiate fundamentals of Marxism and of Trotskyism, of the political economy of capitalism's inevitable decay, and the necessity of challenging and hastening the demise with alternative structures of working-class power. At the very point that capitalism was extending its reach into truly global dominance of the world, progressive intellectuals reached for theoretical refinements that tended to deny the salience of economic relations, class struggle, and all meta-narratives of explanation and outcome that were the only possible ways of seeing the crisis of capitalism and its resolution within its wholeness, within its totality. Instead, many progressive intellectuals became submerged in the postmodern moment, out of which they have yet to rear their often befuddled heads. And their befuddlement has weakened a generation of potentially revolutionary thinkers. I must be getting close to my time, eh?
I think you probably have a couple more minutes.
A couple more minutes, okay. I can probably finish up then. What can break this trend, which is itself embedded in the contradictory characteristics of late 20th century capitalist development and of Stalinism's exorcism of the possibilities of socialism? In my judgment, what is critical is the importance of revolutionary continuity, of dialectically understanding Marxism and its advances, Trotskyism of which is fundamental, as capable of adapting to disjuncture and change, but of continuing the project of revolutionary revitalization. There is among the fashionable advocates of aestheticizing Marxism a reification of innovation, a fetishization of endless revisionism for the sake of cleverness. There is a sense that the past must always be dead and buried, and if it is not deeply enough disposed of, then something must be done to decisively dispense with this past. I sense a little of this, not entirely, but a little of this in the rather confident Platypus notion that Trotsky is as out of place in the post-World War II world as Voltaire or Rousseau would have been in the world after the French Revolution. Traditions die, true. Of course things change, true. 2011 is not 1917. which again is not 1848. That said, there are important truths and venerable ones that need to be recognized, addressed, and acted upon, and that I think still inform us. Thus, against many of the irrationalities of the postmodern turn, the Enlightenment, of course, and I think Platypus does understand this and work with this, has to be defended. I still find, for instance, Diderot's statement that humanity will never be free until the last monarch is strangled with the entrails of the last priest, as true today as it was when it was uttered on the eve of the French Revolution. And all you have to do is look around at the evils committed by the Catholic Church and the sort of obscene atavistic fixation on the royal wedding, which is sort of permeates the popular culture. Marxism assimilates, then, the best thought of the highest stages of cultures that may not be entirely in support of working class revolution and proletarian internationalism. It does not forget the accomplishments of past civilizations that it struggles constantly to transcend. And this is one way in which it differs profoundly from so much of the current intellectual pretense and from the bourgeois sense of progress in which all that is solid melts into air, to quote Marx and Engels again from the Communist Manifesto. We know this because we know the specters that haunt us now, the specters that have historical continuities and that can be located at the conjuncture of knowable historical circumstances, the specters of capitalist crisis and the specters of Stalinism. We know that confronting these specters necessitates addressing the specter of communism that is at one and the same time the historical specter that has been in retreat, but that poses the only decisive alternative to both these current components of our contemporary malaise. And the specter of communism, first identified and constructed by Marx and Engels in 1848, and reborn through periodic uprisings of the insurgent working class in 1871 and 1917, can only be reborn in our time, I think, through recourse to the legacy of Leon Trotsky, who speaks for Marxism's rebirth in the era of Stalinist degeneration. For Trotskyism is the historical continuity of Marxism and Leninism in the era of Stalinist collapse and escalating capitalist crisis. This legacy, of course, of Trotskyism harbors some miscues, some faltering steps, and many, many pretenders who have abused its venerable truths. But this legacy lives in the necessities of our time. The question, what is Trotskyism made of Trotsky's Marxism, I think, can only be answered decisively when Trotsky's Marxism is in fact built into what it was always advocating, a revolutionary party of proletarian internationalism capable of not only challenging capitalism, but of defeating it. As Perry Anderson once wrote in his Considerations on Western Marxism, which was published in the 70s, but which I think is a valid reflection on much of the theoretical development of Western Marxism. This is a quote that I'll end with. When a truly revolutionary movement is born in a mature working class, the final shape of theory will have no exact precedent. All that can be said is that when the masses themselves speak, theoreticians of the sort the West has produced for 50 years will necessarily be silent. Thank you.
Thank you, Bryan. Now will be Mike Mcnair.
Okay, I'm also talking to some extent about...
Mike, I'm sorry, could you put the mic?
Oh, sorry, yes.
Thank you.
I'm actually also talking about continuity, though perhaps in a slightly different way. I start... and inevitably one has to interrogate the question once given. And I start with a couple of trivia. I don't think there's anything wrong with Marx's martyrdom in the sense that it goes with the territory. If you actually fight, there are going to be martyrs. Even in trade union struggles, as often as not, you'll have some poor guy gets run down, Pickett gets run down by a scab, and Trotsky is that on a larger scale. Second, also equally trivial, it's quite wrong to suppose that the Spartacist League was unaffected by the New Left. In reality, the Spartacist League is far closer to the New Left than in its party conception than the Socialist Workers Party until Barnes took over and the Socialist Workers Party became a sort of Guevarist organisation. The more fundamental ones. First off is Trotskyism. What is Trotskyism? And the answer is that Trotskyism is the name which we give to an organized movement which was founded on a certain explicit political platform. And this explicit political platform consists of the theses, resolutions, and manifestos of the first 4 congresses of the Comintern, and the theses, resolutions, and manifestos of the International Left Opposition in 1931 to 33, of the International Communist League in 1934 to 38, and of the Fourth International as founded in 1938 and at its emergency congress in 1940. After that, of course, people can still call themselves Trotskyists and reject everything which came afterwards in terms of the history of that organized movement. As Ted Grant and co., for example, said that the reformation of the Fourth International in 1946 was fraudulent. Le Ouvrière in France have essentially the same line. On the other hand, then there's a whole load of tendencies which take their history from the groups which split to form a coalition of nationalists, the International Committee of the Fourth International in 1953, and a whole history of splintering since then, which of course leaves us with, I've said 57 varieties, actually it was 57 varieties of the far left, but what is certainly true in what's said is that Trotskyism has an inordinate history of splitting, and of splitting in an unprincipled manner, and of splitting prematurely, and of making splits in a pre-Congress discussion in order to deny legitimacy to the Congress, and of so on and so forth. So Trotskyism then is an actual existing live political movement, very splintered one, but nonetheless a live existing political movement, and not some hypothetical reconstruction of the political implications of Trotsky's theoretical work. Second point, classical Marxism. Trotsky is said in the proposal to be the last survivor of classical Marxism. In my opinion, the concept of classical Marxism is severely problematic. I am almost willing to say that classical Marxism is an amalgam in the same sense as the Bukharinite, Trotskyite, fascist counter-revolutionary front. That what the concept of classical Marxism does is to take a set of Marxists who had opposed political positions on a whole range of questions and form them into this entity which is then to be characterized as classical Marxism. I don't know where it came from. I think that the people who introduced it was the Socialist Workers Party of the UK, for whom it provided a cover for their eclectic adoption of Marx, Engels, well not Engels, Marx but not Engels, Lenin, Luxemburg, Trotsky, Lukács, at least the early Lukács, and Gramsci, but again the Gramsci of Ordine Nouveau, or at most when Quentin Hoare did the most extraordinary, and SWPers have done, contorted interpretations of what are contorted documents, Gramsci's prison notebooks. On the other hand, the Northite author, Emanuele Saccarelli, has made, I think, quite correctly demonstrated that Gramsci was, in fact, on the Stalin side of the Stalin-Trotsky division in the Comintern in the late 1920s. So then to say that Trotsky is the last survivor of classical Marxism, or stands amid the ruins of classical Marxism, is to say that he stands amid the ruins of something which never existed. Of Castellum, the ruins of Castellum in Nubibus, of a castle in the clouds. In order to understand these various different authors, it's necessary to interrogate the Marxisms of the Second International and the Marxisms which were in that period outside the Second International, like Sorel's version of Marxism, and the Marxisms of the Russian revolutionary movement, not just Bolshevism, but also the periodism, Bogdanovism, and the influence of Bogdanovism on the military opposition and thence on Stalinism. It's also necessary to include serious attention to Ryazanov's politics as opposed to just this guy's famous historian, to include Parvus and take Parvus seriously in spite of the fact that he turned into a class traitor. It's also necessary actually to read Kautsky. People represent me as wanting to revive Kautsky. I don't want to revive, I certainly don't, I want to revive part of Kautsky, which is the serious long-term attention to the idea that before you get to the point of being able to pose the question of power, you have to build up a movement in non-revolutionary times. I don't in the least wish to revive Kautsky's idiot Anglophilia, his belief that Britain was not an imperialist country, and that imperialism was simply a product of the ascendancy of the aristocracy and the bureaucracy in Germany and France. I don't in the least wish to revise Kautsky's belief that the separation of powers is a normal feature of modern society which has to be maintained, or that the society of the future will be a society of nation states. All of this is crap. And all this crap, which was already there in pre-1914 Kautsky, explains the fact that Kautsky betrayed. But nonetheless, it's actually impossible to understand Lenin without understanding Trotsky. And for that reason, it is also impossible, as is visible in the work of Hillel Tikhtin, it's impossible to understand anything that Trotsky wrote after 1917 without understanding that what Lenin had to say about the party, and the fact that Trotsky drew the conclusion in 1917 that he was wrong on the party question and Lenin was right on the party question. So these are, as I said, how much time have I taken?
About 7 minutes.
About 7 minutes, okay. These, as I've said, are preliminary points in the sense of responding to the way in which the question is framed. My substantive points are three. The first is that there is not a large gap. You cannot, if you read Trotsky's writings as of the high period of the Comintern, and then you leap to the Trotskyists after World War II, there seems to be a huge gap. But actually, if you read Trotsky's writings as of the 1930s, and it's very regrettable that the Socialist Workers Party has refused to allow those to go onto Marxist Internet Archive because it clings to the ability to make money out of them. If you read Trotsky's writings as of the 1930s, the degree of discontinuity between Trotsky and post-war Trotskyism is much lower than is commonly believed. It really is the case that the movement which Trotsky set out to build was the movement which attempted to reconstruct itself with weaknesses, with problems, with etc., after World War II. Second step arising out of this, it is necessary to critique Trotskyism. And I say it's necessary to critique Trotskyism and not just to build on it. It's necessary to critique Trotskyism because precisely what we have is this wilderness of competing sects, none of which can speak to the masses, precisely because whenever they try to speak to the masses, they came across the others. And as far as the masses are concerned, the existence of these sects, well, in Britain, I don't know whether here, it's Monty Python, the Judean People's Front, and the People's Front of Judea. That is the way in which ordinary working class people respond to the state of division of the revolutionary left. So then the question, the critique of Trotskyism has to be based not on the theory, and constructing theoretical overkill, but on the concrete, voted-on programmatic positions. Concrete, voted-on organisational positions. In that basis, if we actually ask where sectarianism comes from, it is clearly not something which is peculiar to Trotskyism. The particular form of sectarianism which is characteristic of Trotskyism is also characteristic of anti-revisionist communism, of all forms of Maoism and of Stalinite. The Stalin Society in England, I think, has broken up into three parts with divergent opinions. Where this fissile character comes from, it seems to me, is actually from the Comintern. And it comes from the Comintern's formal decisions in two respects, formal and written stuff. The first of which is that there is a justification. The split in the Second International was a justified thing, a thing which had to happen. But the justification which they offered for that split was that by splitting they would purify the movement. And in reality, they had disproved that proposition themselves already when Stalin and Kamenev entered into negotiations with the Mensheviks in spring 1917, and when Zinoviev and Kamenev denounced the October Revolution in the bourgeois press in October 1917. The bourgeoisie will find people who will do its work within the most pure, repeatedly split revolutionary organisation. And in fact, the second side of it, the theses on the role of the Communist Party of 1920 and 1921 carry with them the idea that we will avoid the opportunism which paralysed the Second International by a system of bureaucratic control. The right of the Central Committee members, it says, to attend cell meetings and branch meetings with the right of veto over their decisions, and by a system of repeated purging of the organisation to get rid of accidental and non-proletarian members. Now, actually, what turns out to be the case is that the Communist parties under this Bolshevized regime descended into corruption and control by the bourgeoisie far more rapidly than the social democracy under the democratic loose regime which was given to it by Marx and Engels and by Wilhelm Liebknecht. Yeah? Far more rapidly. Because the consequence of that regime is that the space does not exist to do what Lenin did in spring 1917 and fight against the Central Committee through the public press of the local branch, the Viborg district. And the consequence of it is, therefore, that the form of bureaucratic centralism is a form which is more appropriate to control by corruption by the bourgeoisie than the forms of organisation which existed before 1918 to 21. And where that of course assumes that you have a mass party, as the PCF, it was said at the PCF that in the 1930s there's more difference between two communists, one of whom is a member of parliament, a delegate, than there is between two delegates, one of whom is a communist. But outside, when you apply that method of bureaucratic centralism to a small group, the consequence is that inevitably any serious difference leads to a split, irrespective of whether that difference is going to persist for any length of time. And that in turn has the consequence that every Trotskyist organisation is necessarily violently fissile and so on. That's my second point, and my third point, very short one. In spite of what I've just said, it's really important in terms of reconstructing the left today to grasp that there is not a Trotskyist original sin, which means that therefore there is nothing whatever to be learned from the experience of the Trotskyist movement since the Second World War, or a Pavlovite original sin, or whatever. There are things which a revolutionary movement, a small revolutionary movement, can learn from the experiences of entry tactics, from the experiences of electoral tactics, from the experiences of the policies of the Bolivian POR in the 1950s, and again of POR Combate in the 1970s, from the experiences of the Portuguese Trotskyist left in the revolution of 1974-76. I will admit that most of these lessons are negative lessons. But what we can't do is say we don't have to learn these negative lessons because they're merely the product of Trotskyist original sin. And there I leave it.
Okay, thank you very much. Jason Wright.
Looking back on the early years of the Communist Party, James P. Cannon, the old man of American Trotskyism, observed, "On the basis of a long historical experience, it can be written down as a law that revolutionary cadres who revolt against their social environment and organize parties to lead a revolution can, if the revolution is too long delayed, themselves degenerate. But the same historical experience also shows that there are exceptions to this law too. The exceptions are the Marxists who remain faithful to the banner. The ideas of Marxism, which create revolutionary parties, are stronger than the parties that they create, and never fail to survive the fall. They never fail to find representatives in the old organizations to lead the work of reconstruction. These are the continuators of the tradition, the defenders of the Orthodox doctrine. Trotskyism continued and developed Leninism through political combat with Stalinist revisionism, just as Leninism preserved the revolutionary core of Marxism in struggle against the social imperialist lackeys of the Second International. In a poem written in 1935, Victor Sergei described the heroic figures of the past as a constellation of dead brothers, stars in the sky at the midnight of the century, by which revolutionaries could steer a course set on hope. The Second International's conception of a party of the whole class produced Edward Bernstein's passive incrementalism and ultimately the shameful vote for war credits on August 4th, 1914. Lenin's break with the social imperialists marked the rebirth of genuine Marxism on an international level, just as the left opposition's critique of the class collaborationist logic of socialism in one country kept the flame of revolutionary socialism burning after the Communist International was destroyed by Stalinism. In the 1950s, one of the leading figures of the international Trotskyist movement, Michel Pablo, following the lead of Isaac Deutscher, abandoned the struggle to forge independent Leninist parties on the grounds that a new world reality had imparted an inevitably revolutionary dynamic to historical developments. Pabloism is a form of objectivism which assigns the tasks of revolutionaries to a disembodied, unfolding historical process. What social democratic reformism, Stalinism, and Pabloism all have in common is a tendency to negate the importance of the subjective factor in history and to deny the indispensable and central role of a politically conscious and active working class in any genuinely socialist revolutionary transformation. American Trotskyism began in 1928 when the degenerating Communist Party expelled those cadres who refused to denounce Lenin's partner in the October Revolution of 1917. Cannon characterized his group's first 5 years as the dog days of the movement. But by 1934, the tiny Communist League of America was able to lead one of the 3 successful general strikes that launched a gigantic wave of class struggle that ultimately established industrial unionism across North America, as Bryan mentioned. Each of these mass strikes was led by Reds. The Communist Party on the waterfront in San Francisco, A.J. Muste's American Workers' Party in Toledo, and the Trotskyists in Minneapolis. After fusing with Muste's group, the Trotskyists executed an adroit entry into the Socialist Party that brought hundreds of new recruits into their movement. On New Year's Day, 1938, the Socialist Workers Party was launched in anticipation of the founding of the Fourth International later that year. The main programmatic document of the Fourth International, the Transitional Program, is among the most important, least appreciated, and least understood documents in the history of the Marxist movement. It is an extremely condensed text that succinctly distills the key lessons of October 1917, the only successful workers' revolution in history. It addresses the essential problems posed at each stage in the struggle to mobilize the proletariat for the seizure of state power. From fights for minimal reforms right up to the creation of armed workers' defense guards and the expropriation of the bourgeoisie. In 1998, the IBT produced a new annotated version of the Transitional Program to mark the 60th anniversary of its original publication. In our introduction, we observed that the centrality of the subjective factor in the struggle for socialism, i.e., a disciplined political vanguard of the proletariat, lies at the very heart of Trotskyism. Much has changed since 1938, but one thing that has not is the fact that the future of humanity hinges on the creation of an international revolutionary leadership for the working class and oppressed. In recent months, events in both Egypt and Wisconsin have provided negative confirmation of this proposition. In both cases, the skillful intervention of revolutionary parties rooted in the working class could have had immense impact on the consciousness of the newly politicized layers of the population and pushed the struggle far beyond what was achieved. The decline of the ostensibly revolutionary left in the US in the face of the rabid anti-communist ideological offensive of the 1950s was offset to a considerable extent in the 1960s by the rise of the New Left and the various movements of the oppressed, particularly mass black struggles for social equality, the women's movement, and later the gay rights movement. Now, the failure of the old left, and by old left I mean both the Communist Party and the degenerated SWP, the failure of the old left to exert much influence on the new left did not reflect the irrelevance of Marxism, but rather the distance that separated these revisionists from the revolutionary Marxism that they professed. The Stalinization of the Communist Party in the 1920s produced a cadre that eventually came to view unity with the Democratic Party of racism and imperialist war as a holy grail. Even the ultra-reformists of the Second International circa 1914 condemned electoral support to progressive capitalist politicians. But today, this is common practice for almost all Stalinists and ex-Stalinist formations, including Comrade Mcnair's CPGB, which prides itself on putting tactical flexibility above socialist principle. During World War II, Cannon and 17 of his comrades became the first victims of the anti-communist Smith Act when they were tossed in jail as subversives. While the SWP's 1946 thesis on the American Revolution presented a somewhat flawed analysis of the immediate conjecture, it also expressed confidence that revolution remained on the agenda in the US at a time when many other former revolutionaries were moving rapidly rightward, in some cases all the way to outright anti-communism. But the enormous social pressure and political isolation of American leftists in the 1950s sapped the revolutionary capacity of the SWP's aging cadre. By the early 1960s, Cannon's party had succumbed to the same revisionist objectivism they had previously criticized Pablo for, as they hailed both Castro's petty bourgeois guerrillaism and the liberal pacifism of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. If all those who identified with the Fourth International had embraced such positions, it would indeed have signified that the movement Trotsky created was politically dead. But within the SWP, healthy, revolutionary elements organized themselves as the Revolutionary Tendency, and declared war on the revisionist rot eating away at the SWP. A 1963 RT document entitled "For Black Trotskyism" identified the connection between tailing the Castroites and political adaptation to the bourgeois liberal leadership of the civil rights movement. Quote, "In their 1961 Cuban question documents, the majority made it clear that for them, the Cuban Revolution and, by implication, in the colonial revolution as well, the Revolutionary Working Class Party is, prior to the revolution, a dispensable convenience." By their extension of this line to include the Negro question in the US, the SWP majority has made the most serious, overt denial yet of a revolutionary perspective. What they had done is a priori exclude themselves from struggling for the leadership of a most crucial section of the American working class, end quote. The RT counterposed a class struggle program of revolutionary integrationism, first developed by Richard Fraser, an SWP cadre who pointed out that American blacks do not constitute a separate nation, but rather a specially oppressed color caste, forcibly segregated at the bottom of the working class. In November 1963, just a few months after expelling the Revolutionary Tendency, the SWP leadership, notwithstanding a photo of Lee Harvey Oswald selling the militant, sent a groveling condolence to Jacqueline Kennedy on the occasion of the assassination of the chieftain of US imperialism. This single act spoke volumes about the distance that separated the SWP from its Trotskyist past. The core cadre of the RT went on to found the Spartacus League, which itself has since degenerated, as I'm sure most people in this room don't need to be told. But in the 1960s and 70s, the SL not only defended the authentic political legacy of Leon Trotsky, but also made important extensions to it, including identifying Cuba as a deformed worker state, qualitatively similar to Mao's China or Tito's Yugoslavia. The revolutionary SL also argued for a class struggle perspective for black and women's liberation in opposition to the cross-class ideologies of black nationalism and feminism, then popular in the New Left. The SL was also known for upholding the rights of lesbians, gays, and other sexual minorities, and explaining the connection between coercive state regulation of consensual sexual activity and the bourgeoisie's reliance on the nuclear family unit. The SL was also distinguished by an absolute refusal to give any electoral support to bourgeois or petty bourgeois formations, including popular fronts like Salvador Allende's Unidad Popular in Chile. The Spartacists' forthright defense of the Soviet Union, China, and the other deformed worker states from both imperialism and internal counter-revolution contrasted with that of the SWP and most of the world's self-proclaimed Trotskyists who embraced both Lech Walesa's counter-revolutionary Solidarnosc and the CIA-funded Afghan Mujahideen, forefathers of today's Taliban and al-Qaeda. One of the most important contributions of the Spartacist League was the creation of trade union caucuses based on the transitional program as vehicles for developing revolutionary consciousness within the working class. SL supporters in the unions rejected the apolitical rank-and-file economism common to most of their competitors, and instead waged a political struggle to win the most advanced workers to a revolutionary program. In a few important unions, such as the Communication Workers of America, the National Maritime Union, and most significantly, the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, SL-supported caucuses gradually won recognition as the leading opposition to the union bureaucracy. This work was abandoned by the SL as it degenerated in the 1980s, but in the ILWU it was continued by friends and supporters of the international Bolshevik tendency. In 1984, IBT supporter Howard Keeler initiated an 11-day boycott of a ship in San Francisco carrying South African cargo. This illegal action, the first political strike by American workers in decades, established a precedent for a series of similar labor actions, including one-day shutdowns of all West Coast ports in April 1999 in solidarity with Mumia Abu Jamal, and a similar coast-wide action on May Day 2008 to oppose the war in Iraq. These exemplary actions, which offer a glimpse of the power of a class-conscious workers' movement in the future, also demonstrate the potential for revolutionary work in the unions. Steadfast opposition to the imperialist predations of one's own rulers and the defense of any indigenous resistance to such attacks is a litmus test for Marxists. This policy, elaborated by Trotsky in response to Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, is part of the living legacy of Bolshevism. A critical moment in the SL's degeneration came in 1983 when it responded to the bombing of a US Marine barracks in Lebanon with a call for saving the survivors. To the SL's social patriotic demand, Marines out of Lebanon now alive, we counterposed imperialists out of Lebanon by any means necessary. The SL's position on Lebanon in 1983 and its celebration of US military intervention in Haiti last year, which was shamefacedly repudiated after a few months, contrasts sharply with its denunciation of Platypus founder Chris Coutron's 2004 assertion that, quote, the position of military support for any resistance, despite the political nature of such military opposition against imperial power, is not applicable to the present situation in Iraq. The SL correctly responded, insofar as the forces on the ground in Iraq aim their fire against the imperialist occupiers and their lackeys, we call for their military defense against US imperialism. Every blow struck against the imperialist occupiers is a blow struck against the enemy of workers and oppressed all over the world, end quote. However, apparently in the interest of maintaining the prestige of the leadership, the Robertsonians have chosen not to apply the same criterion to Lebanon. And there are other examples of this, including their original response in 2001 to the US invasion of Afghanistan. Most of the key programmatic questions confronting Marxists today have been addressed in one form or another by revolutionaries in the past, and their experience can provide valuable guidance. As regards Iraq, those who reject Trotsky's policy in favor of one of social democratic neutrality on the grounds that the Islamists are just too reactionary, in effect align themselves with the critical apologists for American imperialism. This is not a good place for revolutionaries to be. There is no question that the influence of revolutionary ideas in the American workers' movement today is at a low ebb. But the only way to change this is by taking up the weapons available in the arsenal of Marxism. There is no halfway house between reform and revolution, and no possibility of the victory of socialist revolution without first forging a revolutionary leadership in and of the working class. To do so, in our view, it is necessary to learn from and critically evaluate the best revolutionary traditions of those who preceded us, not to set about reinventing the wheel. This is why we named our journal 1917. I'd like to close with a quote by Trotsky from 1937. Reactionary epochs like ours not only disintegrate and weaken the working class and isolate its vanguard, but also lower the general ideological level of the movement and throw political thinking back to stages long since passed through. In these conditions, the task of the vanguard is above all not to let itself be carried along by the backward flow. It must swim against the current. If an unfavorable relation of forces prevents it from holding political positions it has won, it must at least retain its ideological positions, because in them is expressed the dearly paid experience of the past. Fools will consider this policy sectarian. Actually, it is the only means of preparing for a new tremendous surge forward with the coming historical tide.
Thank you. Richard Rubin.
Since Mike Mcnair talks so much about sectarianism, I have to mention the story of a man, the father of a man I know, whose political trajectory took him from left Zionism to Stalinism, back to left Zionism, and finally to militant vegetarianism. So his last political act was to engineer a split in the Israeli Vegetarian Society because of its lack of sufficient militancy in the cause of vegetarianism. I would like to begin by saying that I'm very pleased to be addressing this topic at a Platypus convention, Trotskyism, not militant vegetarianism. Since I am speaking as a Platypus representative to a predominantly Platypus audience, I will assume some familiarity with the Platypus approach and speak accordingly. To address the question of the legacy of Trotskyism at a Platypus convention is to have to steer between Scylla and Charybdis. Two opposed dangers confront one. The first is to reduce Trotskyism and its history to merely the further elaboration of the history of the, quote, dead left. The other is to collapse Platypus itself into a continuation of Trotskyism as a sort of neo-Trotskyism, perhaps neo-Trotskyism plus Adorno and the Frankfurt School. Both tendencies clearly exist within Platypus, sometimes within the same person. The description of this panel, which asks, what has Trotskyism made of Trotsky's Marxism, clearly exhibits the first tendency. The implication is, unfortunately, that Trotskyism is merely a caricature of Trotsky, who is assumed to be a great Marxist, the last man standing of the Second International Radicals, as a popular phrase in Platypus has it. The Trotskyists tend to be dismissed, however, as mere epigonies, a view that one must admit is sometimes implicit in the self-conception of Trotskyists themselves. This esteem for Trotsky, but dismissal of Trotskyism, is, I will argue, erroneous. The question I wish to raise, therefore, is how one can take seriously the history of Trotskyism, even assert its centrality to the intellectual history of the 20th century left, without being a Trotskyist. To understand this possibility, which in fact lies at the heart of the Platypus project, I must raise an important distinction between revolutionary continuity and historical memory. Platypus, unlike actual Trotskyists, does not believe that revolutionary continuity is possible now. On the contrary, Platypus is premised as a project on the notion of a fundamental discontinuity in politics, the, quote, death of the left, unquote. We understand ourselves as the result, in fact, of this profound revolutionary discontinuity and see our main task as the understanding and elaboration of that discontinuity. In this task, the history of Trotskyism, or rather its failure, lies not as a marginal subject, as might appear to be the case, given the ineffectiveness of Trotskyism as actual politics, but at the center of the story. It is what did not happen and why that matters to us. Excuse me. It's what did not happen and why that matters to us. Trotskyism is the most important thing that did not happen for most of the 20th century. It is the ghost of that ever-deferred revolution that haunts us. Zizek, I think, somewhere refers to Trotskyists as the Hölderlins of the left. As someone who greatly admires Hölderlin, I don't think of that as a put-down, though he obviously meant it that way. This view of Trotskyism is, of course, in direct contradiction with Trotskyism's view of itself. Thus, in an article by Jason Wright, published in PR number 35, the latest issue, the assertion is made that Trotsky's policy was always to put program first. While this is an accurate description of a political tradition for which I still have deep respect, it is one that Platypus represents a fundamental break from. I shall not therefore be addressing the question, what is to be done, but rather, how did we get here? Ultimately, indeed, the point is to change the world, and in this Platypus completely agrees with the classical Marxist tradition. But for us, the intellectual tools to change the world no longer lie as immediately at hand as they once did for our predecessors. Trotskyism, as a political tradition, no doubt has an indefinite shelf life. A generation from now, Trotskyists may very well still be insisting on the centrality of program. But a generation from now, the British monarchy may well exist too. Supposedly got a big lease on life from its marriage yesterday. But just as the British monarchy no longer means what it once was, Trotskyism too has, despite outward continuity, undergone an essential transformation. It is, for example, not at all clear, at least not to me, that the defense of the North Korean deformed worker state in 2011 means the same thing as the defense of the Soviet Union did in 1939, or even the defense of North Korea in 1950, even though the logic that led to one might seem to be the same as that leads to the other, just as the abolition of the British monarchy in the 21st century would no longer have the significance that its abolition in the 17th century did. To pose these questions within the political Trotskyism, tradition of Trotskyism is difficult. Indeed, from a classical Trotskyist perspective, what Platypus most esteems in Trotskyism is perverse, not its self-proclaimed unyielding revolutionary militance, but rather its role as critic of the left from within the left. Trotskyism was born as a response to a twofold historical catastrophe, Stalinism and Nazism. The heroic and one might say deeply ethical character of Trotskyism stems from its refusal to accept the necessity of accommodation to defeat. If many a mid-century intellectual responded to Auschwitz, Hiroshima, and the Gulag with Petronius' arbiter's reflection, si recte calculum pones ubique naufragim est, if you look at it properly, shipwreck is everywhere, Trotskyism presented itself, by contrast, as a raft. Still imbued with a rational 19th century optimism and an Enlightenment faith in humanity and the working class, it insisted on the accidental character of the tragedy of the 20th century. An emphasis on the accidental character of an entire historical epoch, though, sits uneasily with Marxist materialism. It raises difficult questions about the role of ideas and intellectuals in history, particularly the role of Marxist intellectuals in the development of Marxism. As such, a reflection on Trotskyism is also necessarily a broader reflection on both the necessity of and limitations of Marxism as an approach to history. For a representative of an avowedly Marxist organization to emphasize the limitations of Marxism may seem odd, but Platypus is not interested in promoting a sterile orthodoxy. I, for one, would not be greatly offended if someone were to apply to me or to Platypus the label workers' vanguard once applied to Joseph Hansen, namely honest revisionist. I'm more interested in intellectual honesty than the question of orthodoxy. Marxism is necessary for us because in the last 200 years, no better way of thinking about human beings and the alienated social world they have made has been developed. To give up on Marxism is to give up on making sense of history. Marxism may not, however, be fully adequate to the task. It may be merely an approximation. In particular, Marxism may not be able to give a fully adequate account of its own history. Thus, for example, the notion that Marxism is simply That's why paper is good. Thus, for example, the notion that Marxism is simply the intellectual expression of the class struggle generated by capitalism, or that political struggles within the Marxist movement are merely the reflection of class struggles within the party, is, I think, a completely inadequate notion. While I would, for example, agree with the position of Cannon and Trotsky against Shachtman, I do not think that the positions of the latter were simply a manifestation of some petty bourgeois character. This is bad sociology and worse intellectual history. The 20th century has been a confusing time to be a socialist. Often fundamental values such as socialism and democracy have seemed to be, or perhaps really been, counterposed. We need to acknowledge this openly and understand the fractured and tragic history of Marxism as resulting from fractures within Marxism and not simply as deviations from Marxism. In this view, the split, for example, between Shachtman and Cannon is not merely the falling off from Marxism of the former, but an expression of the disintegration of Marxism itself. Such disintegration may force choices on us, and though some of those choices may be better than others, the fact of the necessity of the choice is the essential tragedy. I mentioned earlier that Trotskyism was born of defeat, specifically the triumph of Stalinism and Nazism. Trotsky saw these two catastrophes as intertwined, since Stalinist misleadership certainly paved the way for the German catastrophe. But both Stalinism and Nazism were also ultimately the result of the failed German Revolution. Hitler and Stalin were the product of a world in which Luxemburg, Liebknecht, Lenin, and ultimately Trotsky failed. But if this is true, and I think it is, although it is a view held now only by a minuscule portion of humanity, it nevertheless raises a deeper problem. For there are two distinct types of failure here. One might call one the German question and the other the Russian question. The first question is how it is that the strongest Marxist party in the world could betray its own revolution. The second is how it is that a revolution based on a profoundly democratic and emancipatory impulses could lead to a totalitarian nightmare. The 20th century has provided us with several examples, beginning with the Bolshevik Revolution, of the successful abolition of capitalist social relations in significant chunks of the planet. But none of them has come up to even the standards of bourgeois democracy in terms of political freedom, and the human price of the successful abolition of capitalist social relations has often been horrific. In some cases, like the Khmer Rouge or North Korea, so much so that it is hard to see any progressive value at all in it. On the other hand, quite the opposite of what Marx envisioned, there has never been a successful revolution abolishing capitalist social relations in any advanced capitalist country. And it is precisely in those countries where the working class wields the greatest political power, greatest potential power, that the prospect seems most distant. Although since this certainly cannot be the result of objective conditions, one must attribute it to the power of that mysterious force, bourgeois ideology, or perhaps the disintegration of radicalism through accumulated defeats. Trotsky and Trotskyists, after Trotsky, as well as other non-Trotskyist Marxists, have certainly tried to grapple with these problems. But instead of recapitulating their answers, let me rather outline what I see as the history of the left in the 20th century from a Platypus perspective and the role of Trotskyism in this story, not because Trotskyism provides the answers, but rather because it directs us to the most difficult and essential questions. Although the heroic period of the left is certainly the early 20th century, particularly the late teens and early 20s, I will focus on a later period. The central period in this narrative is the mid-20th century from 1933 to 1968. Two further periods, one from 1968 to 1989 and one from 1989 to the present, might also be distinguished, but I will address these later. If World War I marked a fundamental divide in the history of the left, World War II did also, but in a quite different way. The First World War led to a profound radicalization that profoundly threatened the capitalist world order. The Second World War had a much more ambiguous effects. On the one hand, fascism, the most brutal form of bourgeois class rule, was defeated. But on the other, both bourgeois democracy and Stalinism emerged strengthened. As such, the Allied victory in the Second World War, with both a victory for the Enlightenment, as well as of the Western imperialist powers, because it was also an imperialist conflict, a problem that also confused the Trotskyists in terms of their orientation to it, in which both and the Enlightenment, of which both bourgeois democracy and Stalinism were ambivalent and degenerate representatives, and at the same time it was actually a defeat of revolutionary possibility. The Second World War did not, as Trotsky had anticipated, throw both the advanced capitalist world and Stalinism into profound crisis. Instead, it led into a new era in which the former was stabilized and the latter expanded. Both of these threw Trotskyism into a series of theoretical crises, or in some cases, simple denial of reality to mask a sense of theoretical inadequacy. Furthermore, if the post-war world was one of massively attenuated inter-imperialist competition, marked by the hegemony of a single imperialist power, the U.S., that took on itself the role of organizer of global capitalism, it was also one of decolonization. The end of formal European empire triggered no radical upheavals, however, in the metropoles, and while radical nationalist verbiage was common, in retrospect, it must be admitted that the effect of decolonization has been conservative over the last half-century. Free of direct colonial rule, capitalist exploitation of what is now called the Third World, with the assistance of local brown and black-skinned elites, is more rampant than ever. At the beginning of the process, however, it seemed quite different to many people, and Trotskyists, as much as Maoists, would turn out to be prone to illusions in third world nationalism, so that a political tradition originally based on socialist internationalism and the rejection of socialism in one country prostituted itself before any number of nationalisms. Furthermore, in the late 1950s and early 1960s, developments in both the advanced capitalist world, where Trotskyism was concentrated, and also in the Stalinist world, would prove confusing. After the initial dramatic expansion of Stalinism in the aftermath of the Second World War, Stalinism would, after 1956, begin to liberalize somewhat and furthermore become multipolar. Stalinism was no longer a single exceptional historical experience growing out of the tragic degeneration of a world historical revolution, but seemed rather a family of political types. In the advanced capitalist world, when the left began to revive in the late 1950s and early 1960s, it did so via a new left that wanted to bypass the supposedly sterile political debates of the 30s. Finally, as the 60s heated up, the great Dionysian moment of 1968 seemed to promise to many otherwise presumably sane leftists a revolution by pure ecstasy, a notion which, despite decades of disabuse by Freud's reality principle, is still unaccountably with us. By 1968, Trotskyism had for the most part simply become a variety of new leftism with Trotskyist characteristics. In many cases, whether someone became a Trotskyist or a Maoist was probably a matter of accident. What had disappeared, though, was Trotskyism's role as critic of the left. To the extent that this role was maintained, and I'm thinking particularly of the honorable exception of the Spartacist League, it led almost necessarily to a political style that seemed hyper-sectarian. Furthermore, as the period following 1968 saw a steady decline of the left on a worldwide scale, and a couple of decades later witnessed the peaceful disintegration of Stalinism, even the sense of belonging to a potentially revolutionary moment was lost. Nowadays, to all but the cognoscenti, the difference between, say, the ISO and the Workers' World Party as descendants of Trotskyism and the RCP as descendant of Maoist Stalinism must seem rather arcane. The proliferation of parties, therefore, appears as merely a psychological pathology of the left rather than a multiply obscured reflection of a once significant history. Finally, let me say something about 1989. I was a young college student in the period 1989 to 1991, and it was an illuminating moment for me. It was, in fact, the moment when I became convinced that Trotsky's analysis of Stalinism was fundamentally correct. I'm still astonished that so few other people recognize this. This period was, however, a negative illumination, for if it justified Trotsky via a somewhat long historical detour, it was also self-evidently a defeat. Nowhere did the working class rise to the defense of collectivized property, and in one country, Poland, a mass movement with a working class base was mobilized against the Stalinist bureaucracy. And again, I'm not just mentioning the question of whether one should have sided with Solidarność or with the bureaucracy, but the point is that most Trotskyists simply lied about what was happening and claimed that Solidarność were socialist revolutionaries, which was obviously ridiculous, so-called Trotskyists. The ambivalent aspect of this restoration of capitalism is, of course, that in most cases it was accompanied by an expansion of political liberties, which ironically actually makes possible the advocacy of Trotskyist politics that was impossible for decades under Stalinism. Furthermore, the disappearance of Stalinism as an active political movement has had a paradoxical effect on Trotskyism, since one can no longer distinguish oneself by anti-Stalinism, which is all but universal on the left, even among former Stalinists. But at the same time, Stalinist attitudes persist on the left, but in an anti-Stalinist guise. What then remains of Trotskyism, if not as a possible political practice, at least as a core historical memory? The short answer, I have only a time for a short answer now, I think goes directly to the possibility of saving the memory of the Bolshevik Revolution. Only Trotskyism, I think, provides an intellectually honest tradition on the left through which one can redeem the Bolshevik Revolution from both Stalinism and social democracy. The alternative is simply to dismiss the Bolshevik Revolution as a giant mistake. Chris Coutron once quipped that he imagined that the final political battle on the left would be between the last Trotskyist and the last Maoist. But after today, I suspect that it would in fact be between the last Trotskyist and the last Kautskian. As the Bolshevik Revolution recedes and its hegemony over discourse on the left disappears, the tendency is indeed to dismiss its continuing relevance. Can we not all just get along now without this ancient history? But the issue is no longer one of defending the Soviet Union, but rather of understanding its memory. The Bolshevik Revolution is the great trauma of Marxism. On the one hand, it is the moment at which Marxism became a world historical force, and the hitherto merely theoretical possibility of the abolition of capitalism was raised to the level of actual possibility. But it also represented, in another sense, a loss of innocence for Marxism, as Marxists for the first time were confronted with the reality of wielding state power. Of all the various Marxist traditions that have grappled with that experience, that paradoxical experience of the Bolshevik Revolution, Trotskyism, I believe, represents most fully, even if still inadequately, the consciousness of the ambivalence of that memory as both emancipatory moment and subsequent defeat. That is why Trotskyism matters to Platypus.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to now give each of the panelists a chance to respond to the comments made by their colleagues on the panel, but maybe to ask them to keep it relatively brief so that we can have an opportunity for a kind of extensive audience Q&A. We have approximately 35, 40 minutes to push it a little bit. We're definitely going to get into the 11th hour. So, keep it brief, but give you a chance to respond to each other. Go ahead, Bryan. Yeah, we'll do it in the same order. So Bryan, and then Mike, and then Jason, and then Richard.
Okay, I'll keep it very short, or try to. I suppose for Mike, I'm told that Catholics think that lapsed Catholics are beyond the pale, and they're the absolute worst. I got a bit of a sense of this in terms of a lapsed Trotskyist, perhaps. And I'll ask just one question. The way in which Trotskyism was presented in terms of sectarianism and the inevitability of splits, isn't this a rather extreme formulation that manages to ignore that in the currents of Marxism from the founding of Marxism, splits have always been inevitable on the revolutionary left, and they have been handled in quite different ways. Certainly, and handled on the left and in centrist organizations. In Stalinism, splits were handled by terror, hardly preferable to Trotskyist, quote, sectarian ways of dealing with splits. In social democracy, from the moment that it abandoned the revolutionary project but retained its claim to be of the left, splits have been handled with pretty acute repression, of which, the Labor Party in your own neck of the woods is certainly an example. And we could speak endlessly, those from Canada, about the New Democratic Party and its traditions in this realm. Now, where Trotskyism has, I think, distinguished itself decidedly from these other tendencies is at its best when splits have been, seem to have been inevitable. They have been used, and I would cite, Cannon and the Socialist Workers Party in the 1940 split with Shachtman, where Cannon did say, basically, to Trotsky, and suppressed his inclination for a cold split. At Trotsky's guidance, said, no, use this as a vehicle of education, development of cadre. Cannon felt he was crawling through the mud debating Shachtman on his belly for, so I mean, I think that the question of splits needs to be posed in a far more holistic and manner than simply to see it as a Trotskyist quote problem. And one could go back to Marx in the 19th century as well. Okay, I think Jason, I'm going to just leave aside. For Richard, I guess I found the comments fascinating, and for someone who's fairly uneducated in the Platypus tradition, they were very useful to me. I suppose the question that I would pose is, in posing the two questions that you were not interested in one and you were interested in the other, not so much interested in what is to be done, but interested in how did we get here. I'm not convinced those questions can be asked in in a division. The other point, I guess, that I might allude to very much on the, I mean, I agree with you that, coming back to that Shachtman split, that a kind of derogatory labeling of it as a petty bourgeois split is not particularly useful. But I would say that designation of that political split actually has roots that go back to the original Dog Days factionalism in 30-33 period, where I have been through an immense amount of material in which actually petty bourgeois might be a kind designation of some of what Shachtman and his particular faction were about. Now, I agree that it didn't advance politically, but I think there is an explanation of why that, why that designation emerged. Anyway, that's.
Thank you. Okay, Mike.
Yeah. On what Brian's just said, the problem is that the historical record rather strongly suggests that it is possible to get from grouplets to large parties by way of unification. Now, if the large party is then, if the thing is based on wholly unprincipled politics, then it will explode. And the classic examples, one is Rifondazione in Italy, Rifondazione Comunista in Italy, the anti-revisionist split off the PCI, opened its doors to the Trotskyists and Maoists, and the first phase of that, you go quite rapidly from small groups to a party of 100,000 with significant electoral representation and a real dynamic of creating a movement. Then, of course, it blows up over, God help us, the same bloody question of defeatism and imperialism and so on, the 1914 question, unsurprisingly, but it does so. The Scottish Socialist Party was a fusion of Trotskyist, microscopic Trotskyist groups, which became a large organisation in Scots terms, blew up, in this case, in a peculiar way over bureaucratic centralism, which was that they were hiding the fact that Tommy Sheridan was going to sex clubs because it was inconsistent with their sex-negative anti-prostitution line. And then it blew up in their faces because as soon as the Murdoch press got to know about it, then that turned into a complete catastrophe. But nonetheless, the Gotha fusion enabled the Mass Social Democratic Party. The fusion of 1903 enabled the RSDLP, in spite of the fact that there was a split of factions, split into public factions at that very conference. The continued common identification as a single party enabled that party to grow to mass scale of support in 1912-14, and so on. So it's a what is to be done question. But
I just want to respond to this brief. First of all, it's true there are parties that emerge from a Trotskyist or semi-Trotskyist character that seem to acquire a semi-mass character. I mean, you have the example of the Lanka Sama Samaja party and things like that, or the anti-capitalist party and so forth. But the problem is that in all of those cases, really what you're talking about are parties that, whatever their label as Trotskyist or not, function essentially as left social democratic parties. Now, if you're saying, what I actually believe that, first of all, in the present low state of the left, I think that a debate between, say, a neo-Kautskian perspective or Trotskyist perspective, that both a Kautskian perspective and a Trotskyist perspective are doomed to be, quote, sectarian. But if there were a revival of the left on a significant scale, I actually think that probably the conception that would predominate, given the history we've been through, is in fact some sort of neo-Kautskian conception. I just don't think that that would necessarily be good, because I think that that's essentially recapitulating a failed history. I mean, if you're saying that the most one can expect in the present conditions is left social democracy, well, that may be true. But then one should just sort of put it that way, rather than saying, well, left social democracy is going to be this revolutionary movement.
As far as by comparison with the current line of the bulk of the current practical political line of the bulk of Trotskyist organizations, and I honorably exempt the Spartacists and the IBT, Bernstein looks like massive left move, massively to their left. Yeah? If you look at the current political line of the British Socialist Workers Party, it's a bigger Trotskyist organisation. Bernstein would be to the left of the British Socialist Workers Party. Yeah?
I'd like to give Jason a chance to respond, and then
Thanks.
we'll move to questions from the audience.
Comrade Mcnair has been making me dizzy today. Like, I heard that, Trotsky came over to Lenin's position on the party question in 1917, and, I agree, and I think that's crucial. And I don't know how that reconciles to the idea that the Bolshevik-Menshevik split in 1903 is a product of the Stalinist school of falsification.
No, the claim that there was a split, the claim that there was more than a factional split is a product of the Stalin school of falsification. Not that there was, I'm not saying I admit that there was a split into two separate parties.
Okay, but, also on the point about the Second International, the idea that the sewer socialism, that the incremental electoralism, that the Bernsteinism, that party of the whole class was not susceptible to bourgeois influences. I mean, what do you think Lenin was talking about when he was talking about the labor lieutenants of capital?
I'm saying that Stalinism is more susceptible to bourgeois influences.
I simply
that's not saying a whole lot.
don't think that that's true. I think the degeneration of the
right.
Soviet Union, happened under incredible international pressures. The defeat of the German Revolution. It happens because of the isolation of the Soviet Union, incredibly backward agricultural economy, an incredibly low level of the peasantry, culturally at the point that the revolution happens. And it happens because of the Civil War, because of the imperialists attacking, isolating, trying to strangle the revolution, that you have the conditions set up under which Stalinism and the idea of socialism in one country are able to conquer. And it doesn't conquer unopposed. It conquers with resistance, which is what's significant. In the same way, I think that by glossing over that, there's also this dismissal, which I heard earlier today, of Rosa Luxemburg, as a sectarian or something. But the tragedy of Rosa Luxemburg as a sectarian, in a certain sense, is that she wasn't convinced of Lenin's position earlier than she was. That, there were objective conditions also lined up against her, but that she came over so late to that conception of the party question, at least theoretically. I mean, there were aspects in which practically the Luxemburg's party did, have a party formation, but I want to also address the Platypus comments, and that is, the history of Marxism is a tragedy. The whole history of the left in some ways is a tragedy. It's a huge fucking tragedy that Babeuf's conspiracy of equals fails. It's a tragedy that Paris Commune is drowned in blood. It's a tragedy that we end up with the Stalin turn. But the question I think that you have to start from, I agree with Bryan that you can't separate it. How did we get here and what is to be done? But it is what is to be done. That we have to remember that the reason why there are people dying in Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria right now, is because of the class society that we live in, is because of capitalism. That there are people starving all around the world, that there are workers dying in factories. And if you so philosophically divorce it from the practical, programmatic aspect, I think you lose sight of that. And, I want to pose something to Platypus, which is, those, comrades who have experience coming out of the Spartacist League will know where this quote comes from, but that program, as in revolutionary appetite, generates theory. I think that's where you start from. And one of the things that, I admire most about Cannon is that, even though, as Comrade Mcnair was saying, there were problems with the IC, which he dismissed as, a nationalist liquidation of the 4th. That was not Cannon's finest hour. What was consistent about Cannon and why it's not a symmetrical thing and why we think there is a side with the IC is that revolution remained on the agenda for Cannon in 1953. And if you're not starting from the point that revolution is on the agenda, then what's the fucking point?
Okay, I'd like to move us into questions from the audience. I'm going to remind everyone that we're going to cut you off after 2 minutes, not because we want to close down the perspectives that are coming from the floor, but just simply to accommodate as many questions as possible in the remaining time that we have, which is probably going to only really be about 30 minutes. So if you can keep your questions as brief as possible, and if the panelists can respond to them in ways that are succinct. But again, I don't want in any way to close down either debate or perspectives from the floor or the panel.
Since we have so little time, would it make sense to take 3 or 4 questions and then?
Why don't we take 2? I think 3, sometimes they get a little lost. I mean, I know that maybe splitting hairs, but why don't we take 2 at a time and make sure that you wait for the microphone so that we can capture them for any transcript purposes.
This is a question for Jason. I have the feeling that basically what you're saying is that we have to have like some kind of strong revolutionary morality. And I'd like to bring an example from Argentina, which is where I am from. In the 1970s, Argentina was becoming radicalized as many other parts of Latin America. In 1976, we suffered a devastating military coup that killed 30,000 people, forced hundreds of thousands to exile, blah, blah, blah. By 1982, the working class, against all odds, organizes a general strike against the dictatorship. 2 days later, the dictatorship decides, in order to gain legitimacy, which it is totally losing, the dictatorship decides to invade the Falkland Islands. A very big part of the left joined with the dictatorship, the people that were killing us. Are you telling me that in the name of some kind of revolutionary morality, just because there's some reified concept of imperialism, we had to be just...
We were dual defeatist.
No. I'm not saying we had to be defeatist. We had a working class movement there that was trying to fight against the dictatorship. And I'm not saying that we had to say, oh, how wonderful is Britain. But I don't think that just the anti-imperialist point of view, which basically... A lot of people in the left went to fight for the dictatorship.
Hold on.
I just don't get it.
Let's. I'm sorry, Richard. Let's really stick to the 2 questions so that we can get a couple from the floor.
People can hear me. My question was, hopefully it's just a simple one, about how there is also a lineage in the modern right that comes from Trotskyism. I'm thinking of certain the neoconservative tradition that comes from Trotskyism and has its roots, I guess, in Shachtman, really. But what is it about Trotskyism and its ability to hone in on certain questions of the 20th century that it found itself, ex-followers of Trotskyism as central figures in both the far left and the far right? And is there something about Trotskyism that made that phenomenon? That's my question.
Okay, so just to reiterate, we have a question about the character of an anti-imperialist politics today and problems with that, and then a question about the kind of hereditary lineage of neoconservatism and Trotskyism. Yes, go ahead, Richard.
Well, first of all, I think, as Jason correctly pointed out, the Bolshevik tendency called for defeatism on both sides in that conflict, as did the Spartacist League. With respect, the more interesting question for me is the question about neoconservatism. I actually, at one point, I was close friends with a man who was a founding member of the Socialist Workers Party and a member of the Communist League of America, and name of David Weiss, the older brother of Murray Weiss, if some of you know who he was. And he was making a movie about the life of Leon Trotsky, and I was working as his cameraman, and we went to interview a man named Al Glotzer, who had actually been Trotsky's bodyguard. And it was a fascinating moment because Al Glotzer spoke actually quite favorably about Trotsky, glowingly. And yet Al Glotzer had migrated with Shachtman all the way to basically neoconservatism, into Social Democrats USA and so forth. And at some point, the Cannon-Shachtman split came up, and this was in the 1990s, and suddenly it was 1939 all over again. So I think that that one of the things that's always fascinated me is that Maoists, when they abandon Maoism, almost always seem to become sort of nondescript liberals. Trotskyists are more likely to become some kind of cranky neoconservatives. I actually rather respect that about Trotskyists. I don't actually consider that a drawback. You know, there's a movie called Arguing the World, and it's about a group of 4 Jewish ex-Trotskyists, the most right-wing of whom was Irving Kristol, and the most left-wing of whom is Irving Howe, who became a social democrat, and the other 2 were somewhat in between. And it's sort of this fascinating arc of their rightward trajectory. But one of the things they talk about is how, you know, there were these 2 bays at City College, one of which was inhabited by the Stalinists and the other by the Trotskyists. And what you clearly sense is that within the Trotskyist bay, there was a kind of freedom of discussion and culture. And while I don't want to defend neoconservatism, I think that in a large part, neoconservatism represents a disgust at the Philistinism and dishonesty of much of the left. I think you can see that, for example, in someone like Christopher Hitchens, whom I don't really find that interesting. And I think that one of the aspects of Trotskyism that I didn't emphasize, because it isn't specifically a political point, but it is indirectly a political point, is the relatively non-Philistine character of Trotskyism vis-a-vis what I would call a Stalinist tradition of Philistinism. And I think that that's something that people on the left also have to think about, the culture of intellectual debate. What kind of social milieu is generated by a style of politics? So even though the neoconservatives don't actually represent a continuation of Trotskyism in a political sense, there is a way in which they do represent a continuation of certain styles of Trotskyist politics.
Okay, any other panelists like to respond to the 2 questions?
I think, I agree with the point that dual defeatism is the right response to the situation in the South Atlantic War. Yeah. Although at the time when it happened, I was persuaded of the view that Comrade Jason introduced, that this, in his principal speech, that this question of fighting on the side of the colonized country as opposed to the imperialist country, or supporting the military victory of the colonized country, was a, quote, touchstone of revolutionary morality. I don't actually think that anymore, and I think the example which Trotsky, the great example which Trotsky gave, 2 examples. One is Ethiopia. In the case of Ethiopia, the Trotskyists in Britain initially came to the right answer, which was that Haile Selassie was a British client, and that what this was simply an inter-imperialist war between Britain, proxy war between Britain and Italy, and therefore dual defeatism on both sides. Whereas Trotsky says, no, the victory of Haile Selassie would be an advance for the revolution. That's a mistake. On the second question, I think this is a peculiarity of American politics. I don't know what causes it, because it isn't what happens to ex-Trots in Europe, which is overwhelmingly either they become Stalinists, which there's quite a lot, or they become social democrats. It partly depends on which is the mass party. If the Communist Party is the main party, then they'll tend to become Stalinists. Where the people who we have who become rightists are ex-Eurocommunists. A woman called Melanie Phillips, who was Eurocommunist leader of
Oh, yeah, I know her. I didn't know if she was an ex-Eurocommunist.
Or for that matter, Jack Straw, when somebody who was Home Secretary, when somebody was criticizing him for his illiberal policies and saying, look, you were a Trotskyist in your youth, because they thought he was a student leader, so he must have been a Trotskyist, wrote a long letter to The Guardian explaining why he thought Stalin was right and that was and Trotsky was wrong. So that I just think it's I'm less interested in that, because it seems to me to be just something about the dynamics of American politics, which doesn't have any application outside, I don't know about Canada, but certainly doesn't have any application outside North America.
Okay, either Jason or Bryan, if you'd like to respond.
Take some more questions.
Okay.
Meadows.
Well, Bryan, would you like to, or?
I think let's just, I don't have much to add.
Okay, so why don't we move to the next set of questions?
Yeah, I just say that the Malvinas was not Argentinian territory. Had it been Argentinian territory, the IBT, and I don't doubt the Spartacus League would have had a defensive position. So that's an important distinction. I think what's important to understand about this is that everybody who might assume a certain label shouldn't be considered to be that. And what we're looking at when we're talking about the people that ended up working for the CIA, because that's where many of them ended up working for, or various people who are connected, came from the Shachtman group, which had split with Trotskyism in 1940, and then subsequently continued to evolve to the right, joined the Democratic Party, and by 1961, Max Shachtman was supporting the invasion of the Bay of Pigs by the Gusanos to reverse the Cuban Revolution. Now, if you're going to call the guy still a Trotskyist at that, you can puzzle over how can Trotskyists support CIA-supported counter-revolution. It's no mystery at all. They break with Trotskyism, and 20 years later, they're working for the CIA. That's just how it happens. And the reason that it happens that way more frequently in the United States than in Britain is there is no large Labor Party bureaucracy to absorb them. We get the Democratic Party instead, within which the CIA is always looking, headhunting for smart people. I would also point out that there's a connection in the German events. In 1923, there was a genuinely revolutionary opportunity, and Trotsky was pegged by elements in the Comintern to go there and coordinate what they hoped would be a successful insurrection. Stalin blocked that because of the inter-party factional maneuvering that was going on at that point. Lenin was in bad shape, and Stalin feared that another victory for Trotsky would secure his position and threaten Stalin's role in the bureaucracy. That's a fact.
I'll just have to ask the gentleman to wrap up. I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, let me just conclude by saying that defeat in 23 then conditions the rise of Hitler. Trotsky again comes forward with the correct policy for the German workers' movement. He says, the communists and the social democrats should join together and smash the Nazis. Had that taken place, the communist movement would have hegemonized the social democrats, and again the German Revolution would have been posed in very direct and immediate terms. So a lot of these things are historically conditioned, and we can't just puzzle about them in the abstract. You have to get in and look at the actual history, and I think when you do, you will see that the history of genuine Trotskyism is a pretty pristine one.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I have
We'll take, is there a question in the back? We'll take the question in the back. Sure.
so I have a two-part question, which is kind of a following up. So one is, in response to Jason of the IBT, you said, what's the point if revolution is not on the agenda? So I guess my question to the panel is, in what way can we say that revolution is in any way on the agenda today? And then the second thing is kind of in response to the question of, how does a blow to U.S. imperialism today lead to more revolutionary possibilities in the U.S. or abroad? And in what sense, like in the history of Trotskyism, have you seen a blow to U.S. imperialism or imperialism, whatever, leading to more revolutionary possibilities?
Okay.
Vietnam. I mean, I would say that the U.S. defeat in Vietnam, even more so than what happened to the U.S. in the 50s in Korea, Vietnam had reverberations, and that's why you had the phenomena of the New Left, and there was an interrelationship there, and you began to get strikes and activity within the workers' movement, and a radicalization, and I really think that is linked. I mean, it's linked to the civil rights movement emerging, but it's also linked to the fact that the U.S. was losing the Vietnam War. And, the rise of Maoism, I think, was because the Viet Cong started to look, very sexy as something that was fighting the U.S. to a standstill.
I'm a little skeptical of that in the sense that, for two reasons, one of which is the Wildcats, there's an overlap between the civil rights movement phase and the rise of wildcats in the States in the early 60s. And it isn't obvious that the US is losing the Vietnam War until at least the Tet Offensive, and actually probably in '68, and actually after the Tet Offensive. So it seems to me that the Vietnam War in itself, in a sense, the Vietnam War provides an opportunity for the left to reach out to wide forces because of the political illegitimacy of the war, and to an opportunity to undermine, to attack the coherence of the American armed forces, which is fundamental. But I don't think, if you think about when when Vietnam was actually won and the tanks rolled into Saigon in 1975, that's actually the trigger for the breakup of the new communist movement, for the moment at which the new left loses its elan.
Yeah, I actually tend to agree with Mike Mcnair on this. I also think that there are two separate questions that are conflated. There's a question of the empirical probability of a defeat of U.S. imperialism, which leading to a revolutionary situation, which I think is highly unlikely, and the sense that it is one's revolutionary duty to advocate for the defeat of U.S. imperialism no matter what. And I think that those two questions really are separate, because one is really a question of revolutionary morality and one's self-conception as a revolutionary. And I think that the people who advocate for the defeat of U.S. imperialism or that those positions are positions that more about maintaining their own sense of themselves as revolutionaries than an actual empirical prediction, that I don't think that they actually believe that the defeat of U.S. imperialism on the agenda. I mean, in terms of the possibility of revolution is imminent in capitalist society. I mean, in that sense that the objective conditions for socialism are more than overripe in a place like the United States. So really, the obstacles are in people's heads. And the question of whether those obstacles can ever be overcome is a very difficult question to answer. But they don't have to do with the development of the productive forces. So the tragedy of the absence of left politics in the United States or Europe, or really the decay of left politics of the last 30, 40 years, is completely different from the problem posed by Babeuf's conspiracy of equals in France in the 1790s, when really the objective conditions, I think, did not exist.
Okay, Bryan.
I tend to agree more with Jason on the question of U.S. imperialism and defeat. But I think the question I will speak to is the question on the back about, how is revolution on the agenda? And I agree with, quite a bit about what Richard said, but I'd extend it, and that is, if you look around America and around the world, it would be very hard not to, for anybody on the left to claim that revolution isn't actually necessary given the circumstances we're all dealing with. Is revolution on the agenda? Absolutely. It is overripe, and in the rottenness of the situation resides a great deal of the problem. But a question that I would have posed to the panel on the first night, last night, where I think this question also came up in terms of, and I think it was Andrew who was basically saying that there's just no possibility of revolutionary organization now. And the question as an historian that I would what I would throw out is that when has it been a good time to form a revolutionary organization? I mean, if you want to go back, centuries, you will see that there were always incredible barriers. Now, you can talk about, how the circumstances are, a little better internationally, but much worse domestically, and some situations are not. The fundamental question is, the distance from and degeneration of 1917. I mean, that's a phenomenal, a phenomenally significant matter. But it has never been, and it never will be, an ideal time to form a revolutionary organization and to try to move towards creating the possibilities that that organization can intersect with other organizations and can intersect in the objective conditions in such a way that will build the possibilities of revolution and advance the prospect for revolution? That's the fundamental question. And you can't really say, well, now is not a good time. And if you wait for the propitious moment, history will pass you by, and it will not be pleasant.
Okay, I think we're going to have to take one more round of questions and then end with that, unfortunately. I would like to just say, for those who have not had a chance to ask their questions, that this transcript will go into print in the PR, the transcript from this event, and that we would invite anybody to publish a response to it in those pages as well. Okay, so we'll take the question from the gentleman in the back.
I wanted to sort of respond to the responses to the question about revolution being on the agenda. I think that there's a difference between saying that there's a necessity for revolution and saying that revolution is a practical prospect. Or even, I think that what Bryan just mentioned is important, that forming a revolutionary organization, in other words, engaging in the politics of organizing a group of people who are committed to revolution, that's on a practical prospect of the present. So I think that we'd have to sort of disambiguate this idea of revolution being on the agenda. In a sense, I feel like called upon to defend Platypus's honor on this score, which is to say that our project is about the possibility of putting revolution back on the agenda, but that the issue is how to get there from here. And so, I feel like tempted to raise the question of objective and subjective, although I have sort of misgivings about using that kind of traditional language, to say that objective conditions are overripe, but subjective conditions are nowhere near ready. It raises the question that Richard posed, which is the question of continuity. In other words, programmatic continuity. To say that the program of the Communist Manifesto is still applicable, or the program of the transitional program in 1938 is still applicable, and therefore all we need to do is sort of organize around a sort of an established program, which leaves out a great deal in terms of how to get there from here to make revolutionary politics in any kind of meaningful way an actual practical prospect. And I think that, again, the commitment to revolution and the recognition of the necessity of revolution is one thing, but how to get there from here and how to make it an actual practical prospect is something quite different. I also feel the need to invoke, of all people, Noam Chomsky, who pointed out that the US was hardly defeated in Vietnam, meaning the US pulled out when it was good and ready to after it had completely destroyed the country, and that it's very difficult to in fact say that the US was defeated, let alone to say that that was a progressive political development either in Vietnam or elsewhere. And so again, I seldom would invoke Noam Chomsky except on this score. I think that he's pointing to something that we should be familiar with from the history of Stalinism, which is to call defeats victories. And defeats can be quite obscure things, but they can also, be recognizable as defeats, namely millions of people killed, the environment destroyed, etc. Stalinism sort of, instantiated yet again in Vietnam.
To call that you wrap up.
To call that a victory is problematic, to say the least.
I wanted to ask, I thought Bryan's way of formulating this issue about whether Trotskyism is a dead tradition. You pointed out, you said traditions do die. And I think this relates in some ways to Mike's comments about, was there this thing called classical Marxism? And in some ways, I think calling something classical Marxism is saying to some extent that Marxism was once an alive tradition, right? We talk about like classical philosophy. It's not that like Plato and Aristotle and the Epicureans all agreed with each other. The issue is that they were having real conversations, they were discussing real problems, there was a development of thought, there was a sense in which there was a sense in which what they were saying to each other mattered. And in some ways what a dead tradition, it seems to me, in some sense means, is that the kinds of conversations people are having with each other, the development of ideas is stalled useless, etc. So I guess I would just like to pose to all the panelists this question: is Trotskyism a dead tradition? And if it isn't, how do we know that it's not just our kind of nostalgic hope that it isn't, that's making us think that it isn't? How do we know that, or how would we know if it really were dead?
May I answer that?
Yeah, go ahead, Richard, and start.
I don't think that Trotskyism is a dead tradition. I think that it's one that unfortunately has become opaque, and that's a different problem. And I think that if Trotskyism is in fact a dead tradition, that it in fact means that Marxism is a dead tradition. And I would say the same thing about Marxism that I would say about Trotskyism, that it's something that has been opaque. Trotskyism is more opaque than Marxism because it's more specific and symptomatic to the 20th century and tied up fundamentally with the question of the Bolshevik Revolution and Stalinism. So I would say we wouldn't know if it were a dead tradition, except in the negative sense, that things can get arbitrarily barbaric and bad, and that tradition can be hopelessly obscured, buried, so to speak, but that doesn't mean that its validity is gone. What it means is that it's inaccessible to people. And that's a different problem from something being dead. So for me, the question is about the accessibility of the tradition and what that accessibility would mean. I mean, and I always want to say two things. One isn't the question of like what is to be done. I'm not trying to sidestep the issue of what is to be done as a problem. I recognize that it is a central question. The truth is that I don't really know what is to be done, whereas I have a better sense of how we got here. Now, there are people who know exactly what is to be done. Let's all join the international Bolshevik tendency. So if that's convincing to you as an answer, go ahead and join the international Bolshevik tendency. The other point I wanted to make was that a quotation attributed to an anonymous member of Platypus about Trotsky being out of place in the post-war world, actually that was from me. And it actually is, I felt somewhat of a misquotation because I think that the context actually gives it a different sense from what it was given. And
Sorry about that, Richard.
But the analogy that I meant, and the analogy, it was in the context of a talk at the Left Forum, and it was about Trotsky and Benjamin. But the analogy to Rousseau and Voltaire vis-a-vis the French Revolution was Rousseau and Voltaire died 11 years before the French Revolution. They both died in 1778, 11 years before the French Revolution. Yet clearly, the French Revolution is in a profound way the heir of the thought of Rousseau and Voltaire, and that would have been obvious at the time. So it wasn't an attempt to claim that Trotsky was somehow irrelevant to the post-war world. It was an attempt to say that when one thinks of Trotsky and Trotsky's political experience, it's particularly embedded in that interwar period, or the period from the 10s, to 1940 when he was assassinated. So
okay, I'd like to allow the other panelists to make. I think we may have to just treat these as concluding remarks as well, if that's okay with everyone. If there's no objections, okay. Go ahead.
Okay, I want to just clarify because it came across as a little mechanical. I think what I was saying about Vietnam, but I do think that fracking, the fact that infantrymen in Vietnam were turning guns on their own officers, is a part of what led to the U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam. And I do think that you end up with a deformed worker state in Vietnam, which, granted, okay, you don't have workers' democracy there, but you have, the capitalism having been overturned. And I think that it's significant that whereas there's been a strong strain of isolationism and pacifism in the U.S., for instance, in response to World War I, that you actually had a split in the anti-war movement between, the out now, bring the boys home, save our boys socialists, and people like Maoists and comrades like the comrades of the Spartacus League at the time, who were actually calling for the defeat of U.S. imperialism. And you know, that is a significant development in terms of where subjective consciousness, where revolutionary will was. And you know, this idea that the position that's being ascribed to me is a moral position, I guess it is a moral position, but what I'm really trying to talk about is revolutionary will. And I think that what is needed is the will to take, you know, to advance the subjective, you know, consciousness and to build a revolutionary party in the face of what are many and continuous opportunities that have presented themselves, like why I think Trotskyism is still relevant and why I think that we who have the revolutionary will should still identify with the movement that Trotsky built, is because I think the fundamental questions that he was addressing, the fundamental questions that, you know, the living continuity of Marxism addresses, you know, that these are the questions that are still posed in the world today, that we are still in an imperialist epoch, and that these are the best answers, the best solutions that have been, you know, so far invented. And to dismiss them because of historical pessimism is to throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that the question of revolution on the agenda is, in a sense, actually the fundamental question. And the question is, there is a difference between saying revolution is on the agenda in a historical sense because it's imminent, it's posed by capitalism. Revolution is on the agenda in the medium-term sense, because of the rise of the workers' movement, which was certainly the case between the 1870s and the 1970s. And revolution is on the agenda in the immediate sense, for which V.I. Lenin gave us a wonderful test. The ruling class cannot go on in the old way, and the masses will not go on in the old way. And we've actually just seen what that means for revolution. We've just seen in North Africa what that means for revolution to be on the agenda, that the ruling class cannot go on in the old way, and the masses will not go on in the old way. Okay, now then the question is, I agree with the comrades 100% on the fact that in terms of what's going on in North Africa, the most probable outcome is defeat. And the most probable outcome is defeat because there is no revolutionary leadership. But the error of the Trotskyists, and I won't say this is necessarily Trotsky's error even, the error of the Trotskyists is not to recognize what led up to February 1917, which enabled the Bolshevik Party to actually give revolutionary leadership. And we have seen Trotskyists in revolutionary crises. Argentina in 1976, the Partido Socialista Trabajadores of Moreno failed that test. The POR Combate in the earlier 1970s failed the test of revolutionary crisis in Bolivia. The Trotskyist left in Portugal failed the test of revolutionary crisis in Portugal. But if we ask why they failed that test, actually it's not primarily a matter of their political errors. What's primarily a matter is they simply did not have enough forces. They have come up with the image that Bolshevism was microscopic in February 1917, was like one of the little groups that we have now. And a Bolshevik party of 17,000 in February 1917, under complete illegality, under conditions where if anyone was known to be a Bolshevik, they'd be conscripted and sent to the front. That's not a little organization. That's a mass party under those conditions. It's necessary. I hope that revolution is not on the immediate agenda in the United States and in Europe. Because if it is, the outcome will certainly be a very serious defeat for the working class, because we are not in a position. It doesn't matter how pure, how militant, how much personal will each of the little individual groups has, as long as we have these little individual groups and not parties of hundreds of thousands, if revolution comes, we will be defeated. And we have time, perhaps, to set out on the road of building parties of hundreds of thousands and of millions, which could meet the tasks when the ruling class cannot go on in the old way and the masses will not go on in the old way.
Yes, and we can reflect on the question that Richard wants to have us look at of how we got here and how that has all happened, and asking that question and trying to pose answers to it is fundamentally important. But within that, there will inevitably be differences of opinion in terms of what needs doing now, what is to be done now, and all of the remarks that I made, which I can see some of what Chris is getting at, but the notion that there has to be revolutionary organizations form in non-revolutionary situations, and you're right. If the revolution was declared now, it would be a massive defeat for the working class and the left. But what revolutionary organizations do in that situation is not necessarily proclaim that they are here to lead the revolution. They work in ways that create the possibilities so that there will be, at some future point, a different set of circumstances. We are overripe for revolution. We obviously are underdeveloped in terms of our capacity to carry forward any kind of sustained victory. No doubt about that. Now, whether this is the question of, is Trotskyism dead, and how would we know? How do we know that the Earth is not flat? There are traditions that die, and there are traditions that should die. My sense is that Stalinism is a dead tradition. It had a long death march, but I think it has been buried. It doesn't mean that it's been vanquished, as a political force in every political mobilization in every locale. But Trotskyism is not at all of that order. Its explanations, its historical record, its particular stands, its theoretical insights, its programmatic articulations, they do seem to me, and again, one can't be convinced at me saying these up here, but they do seem to me to be of a fundamentally different order. They do seem to me to be the living continuity of Marxism and Leninism in a particular epoch. And we are still in that epoch of capitalistic decay and of living in the shadow of what Stalinism has done to the revolutionary left and its promise and possibility.
Okay, with that, we'll have to conclude for the evening. Again, just want to thank all of our panelists for participating and for traveling here, as well as all of you for sticking out. We're actually very close to leaving the 11th hour, literally in the 12th hour of the convention on Saturday. But I want to say, if people still have the stamina, and I am semi-reluctant to say this, but I'm having a party at my house tonight. And I'll even give the address, although I don't want it in the transcripts. 4742 South Ellis, apartment 2. You can ring the buzzer. It's BYOB, and bring your politics as well, because we'll continue to debate there. So thank you very much for everybody for sticking out.